Hello and welcome back to the lecture on budgets and fiscal policy. Now, the simple Keynesian cross model suggests that government expenditure can feed through to increased income, and the amount of extra income that it feeds through to seems to depend on the slope of this expenditure line, E. Now, to look in a bit more detail at why that is and what affects the slope, we need the important concept of the multiplier. So we'll move on to that next. So now we come to a concrete example that tries to illustrate the principle of this, which is off to Malaysia. And suppose that the Malaysian government decides that we'd like to pump 100 million ringgits into Malay ringgits into the economy. So they do that. And from that 800 million, say just 1,000 of that goes to a teacher as extra pay. So straight away, economic output has been boosted by 1,000 because she's doing an extra 1,000's worth of Malaysian ringgits in terms of teaching services. But that's not the end of it, because from those 1,000, she puts 250 under a mattress or in the bank. The rest, 750, she spends. And of that 750, 120, say, goes to a builder. Just do some repairs on the house, build something extra. So that builder then has done 120 ringgits of extra economic output. So now we've had 1,120 of extra output. But that's not the end either, because the builder saves 15 and spends the remaining 105. From that 105, maybe he spends 50 on some new shoes. Okay, so whoever produces the shoes, that's another 50 of value. The shop owner, where he gets the shoes from, saves 35 and spends the other 15. 5 of that is to clean the windows of the shop. So the window cleaner does 5 ringgits worth of window cleaning. Window cleaner spends the lot, all 5. One of these has a cup of tea in the market, so that's 1 ringgit worth of tea. Now we're going to think about just this 1 ringgit, which started here. Some of it, that 1 ringgit was one of the ones from here that went to here. One of the ones that she spent went to the builder. One of the ones the builder spent went to the shopkeeper. One of the ones that the shopkeeper went to the window cleaner. And that's the same ringgit that came to the tea seller. So that 1 ringgit has passed through several hands. So that particular 1 ringgit created 1 ringgit of extra demand for each of these things. Cup of tea, 1 ringgit's worth of window cleaning, of shoes, of building and teaching. So just that 1 ringgit alone created 5 ringgits of extra demand so far, because we don't know what the tea seller did. So that's 1 ringgit out of 800 million. So what happened to the other? Now, you couldn't really do that for every single 1 ringgit. That's just not possible, even with some smartphone technology monitoring your every move. Not yet. So is it possible so far? Thank goodness. So we need a way to estimate the overall effect statistically. And the solution is this. We use this idea of marginal propensity to consume that I showed you briefly in that diagram above. How much, when people get extra earnings, how much do they consume? Because it's the consumption part that is then passed on to somebody else and produces more economic value, or demand for economic value. So the teacher spent 750 out of 1,000, that's 75%. Builder, 87.5%. Shop owner, window cleaner, spent everything, so 100%. We don't know what happened to the tea cleaner. Perhaps it fell down a crack or something, or they spent on something else. So at each level, it's different, unfortunately. So that doesn't quite solve the problem. So it varies from person to person. So what you do is you try and estimate the mean value for the whole population. And one of the reasons I chose Malaysia is that it was fairly recently a study estimated it was 0.53. So on average, your Malaysian, if they get an extra 100 ringgits, they're going to save 47 ringgits and spend 53 ringgits out of an extra 100. And it varies wildly from person to person. That's the average. So here we had the 800 million initial rise. If recipients did say 53% of that and save the rest, if you work out 53% of this, that means that we'd expect that they'd save this much extra. Yeah, sorry, they'd spend this much extra. So this is the initial increase. Of that, this percentage is spent, which is this much. So you get an increase in spending of this much. And then the people that receive this, they themselves will also spend 53%. And 53% of this is that. And then it keeps on like that. Now, if you've been in my lectures before, you probably sense some sort of table coming. So this is how you can lay it out on a table, looking at what's called each round. So the first round, the government pumps in some money. That's why it says an increase in government spending, 800. This is a running total. But from this 800, 53% is spent by the people that received it, which is this much. And then that's the running total. So that plus that gives you that. But then from this, 53% of this is then spent, which is going to be this. That's the running total. And then 53% of that, 53%. So just over half is spent at each time, is passed on to the next lot of people. This is just adding up this column. So what's the total increase so far? This is looking at the ratio, it's saying, okay, how much is the total increase compared to the 800? So by the time it got to here, it's slightly more than double. See, 800 compared to 1600. So it's got to about 2 point something. Even this is not enough space. So here we go. It's back to my obsession with Excel. If you put it into Excel, you can just easily carry on calculating it. And you don't have to go on forever, because eventually the change gets so small, half, that it gets to less than one, whatever the unit is in Malaysia, 1/100th of a Malaysian ringgit. So beyond that, it stops. So what you do then is you can add up the grand total, you get this, and this is the final ratio. So it's just slightly more than doubled. And then you can see what you got. So what was the overall effect of this? Well, it led to a final increase of 1702. So 800 million gave you an increase of 1,700 million, which is slightly more than 2 times the initial rise. So what we call the government spending multiplier in Malaysia is 2.13. So anytime the government pushes money into the economy, then the final effect on economic demand in the short term is going to be 2.13 times that initial spend by the government. Now, if you're looking back at this, it all looks a bit impractical. The good news is you don't have to do all this adding and all that calculation. There's a way of jumping straight to this number, and this is using a formula called the multiplier formula, which is just this. C is this multiple parentheses consume. So if you were doing this in an exam or test or part of your assignments, or in the future when you're a consultant, you wouldn't do any of that calculation. All you would take is the 0.53 number, and you do 1 divided by 1 minus 0.53. Okay, that's the C. So 1 divided by 1 minus 0.53 is the same as 1 divided by 0.47. If you check on your calculator, you find it's 2.13. So you jump straight to that number. So to show you that demonstration of this, another example, much quicker. Suppose the Nigerian government increases spending by 30 million naira. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.74, how much does national income rise by in the short run? Well, multiplier is this, using that formula. 1 divided by 1 minus 0.74 is 1 divided by 0.26 is 3.85. Once you have the 3.85, you multiply that by the increase. So 30 times 3.85 is 115 million. So in Nigeria, we'd estimate that an increase of 30 million in government spending increases demand by 115 million. It's a much bigger multiplier effect. Here question, if we're in class, I'd ask you to think about this. So we're not in class, so if you want to pause the video for a second, decide which of these you'd go for. And I'm going to go on to the next. So decide now. It would be done with clickers. Ignore these, that's because no one's in class answering. Correct answer is in a poorer country, and that's as was illustrated back here, with Malaysia is a far more wealthy country in terms of per capita income than Nigeria. So the idea is that when people are on average richer, they tend to save more of any extra money they get. Whereas poorer people, they haven't got that choice, they just have to spend it. So, whereas in Malaysia, people are spending only slightly over half an extra bit of income. So that gives you, this number's smaller, so that number ends up bigger. So 1 divided by that gives you a smaller result compared to Nigeria, where because people are much poorer on average, if they get some extra money, they spend 74% of it quite soon in the short term. So that number's bigger, which makes this number smaller, which makes the overall result bigger. So the multiplier's larger. And logically, because people are consuming more, that multiplier process carries on through more steps. So in a poorer country, we'd expect it to be higher. And a similar question. So this is just, there we go. Thinking about how you do it. So if you're in Namibia, I thought I spelt it like our dear friend President Trump, but I didn't. It's not Namibia, Namibia. If you increased government spending of this much, so this is your increase in fiscal policy, 2000 I need to check this. This is, I've invented a new number system there. Let's see if this will work. Okay, so 2,250 million. It's Quatch, is it? Maybe, not sure. And so it's the same country, but the question here is, once they've decided on how much money they want to put into the economy, which is going to have a bigger effect on national income in the short term? Is it spending money on government economists, which seems like a smart idea, or is it spending money on government cleaners? So have a think, for the same increase in government spending, if they direct it mainly this way or mainly this way, which is going to have the big effect on income? So decide what you'd answer. And then we'll move on to the next part. Ready, go. Well, there won't be answers built in. The answer you should come up with this one, because government cleaners tend to be less well paid and poorer than government economists. So if they get some extra money, they're going to spend some more of it very quickly, whereas the government economists might decide to spend some of that, decide to save more of that. So you get a bigger set of knock-on multiplier effects through putting it into government cleaners. So I think the answer should be B. Right. I'll just mention this other version of the multiplier. The first version applies to if the government is increasing or cutting government spending, but of course the other side of fiscal policy is taxation. How much does governments decide to take from you in taxation? In this one, we go back to Malaysia and say, let's say they increase taxes by 400 million. But this is the same table as before. Now, what you notice here, there's no entry for 400. And there's no entry comparing it to way back here for G. You think it would start with a delta T, and then these are all delta C's because it's a consumption effect, private households. This is delta G because the first thing is that government teacher doing some extra work. But in this case, there's no delta T, there's no 400. So think about why that might be. And if you have a think, the answer is because taxation, unlike government spending, doesn't directly correspond to somebody doing some work, which is economic value in itself. So government, if you increase government spending to a teacher, then that's increasing the teaching service she does, the value of that in the economy. Whereas when you just tax, that in itself has got no value. But why isn't the first row of consumption reduced by 400? These are all reduced because you've taken money away from people, so it's negative, they're going to spend less. Why isn't the first a hit of 400? And the answer is that 400 that you're taking off the first set of people, well, everybody in the economy, that 400 you're taking away from people, that would not all have been spent on consumption. Some of it would have been saved and some of it would have been spent on consumption. So you have to calculate how much would have been consumed, which is 0.53 times the 400, which gives you this 2.12. So the first step in here is already the marginal propensity to consume times 400. So you start from there. And then the sums are the same from here on. So this, how much of this that went to other people, how much would that have been spent? So times 0.53, times 0.53, times 0.55, so on. So each stage you're here working that money that the next row of people would have had, how much of that would they have spent, which is the times 0.53. So here's you're adding up the total fall, here you're adding up the ratio. Probably gets, I'll do the spreadsheet there. Here's the explanation of why the first row is at 400, which I won't go through again. Here's when you put it into a grand spreadsheet. It falls too little to measure. So the final turns out as this. So taking 400 out of the economy, 400 million, leads to a total decrease in 451 million, which is about 1.13 times as big. And as before, you don't normally do all these calculations. There's a way of jumping straight to that, which is this. So what's the final effect of this 400 million? Well, it's this. That's the 1.13 times. This is called the taxation multiplier. The way of getting this directly is using this formula, which is very similar to the other formula, except you have a C on top. So there's marginal propensity to consume. So you have that on top, 1 minus that on the bottom. So you end up with this divided by this, which gives you 1.13. And as another example of it, in Costa Rican dollars. So if the Costa Rican government cuts taxes by 10 billion, if marginal propensity to consume is 0.64, how does that affect national income? So you put this into the equation, you find 1.78. So income changes by this much, 1.78 times the 10, which is 17.8 billion. And note that it's an income rise because you're cutting taxes. So if you did put this into a table, it would be positive numbers this time because you're cutting taxes. Okay, and then we turn to the final section, which is bringing in interest rates and what effect do those have. So this will introduce a new model and then link to the next lecture.